conversation, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Ladee Hubbard to Paris from Berlin for a conversation with our current fellow Anna Paulina Lee on performances of race and historical representations. Anna and Ladee approach, one through scholarly studies and the other through the form of the novel, the accountability of cultural representations in producing racialized national categories that have shaped labor and whiteness politics for centuries. In Mandarin Brazil, Anna studies how race, representation, and memory structured the new Brazilian identity in the 19th century, late 19th century, as it shifted from black slavery to what was known as yellow labor. And in her latest novel, The Rib King, Ladee draws a complex portrait of black servants working for a white family in DC in the early 20th century, and how a commercial venture they all embark upon upends what is accepted and expected. And very quickly, the devastating backdrop of slavery and the Great Migration seeps through the cracks of this intimate story and reveals America's fascination with black iconography and exploitation. Both Anna and Ladee examine how the long shadow cast by folklore, painting, music, all modes of representation of the past makes it hard to tell who owns the narrative. Tonight, our guests will talk about how fiction can help explore history, a question that actually comes up a lot in informal discussions here at the Institute. I'd like to thank James and Justine for their help in organizing this evening. We don't have books for sale tonight. There's a flyer at the front that can tell you where you can purchase Anna's book, which is Mandarin Brazil, at the Erol Library on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. And Ladee's Rib King is available online from Galignani, so you can support our small bookstores. So Anna and Ladee will speak for about 40 minutes, and then they're happy to take questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahi, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by thanking the Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Columbia University and the Columbia Global Center in Paris, and especially to Marie Dorini, James Allen, and Eve Greenstead for organizing tonight's event. Ladee Hubbard, I'd like to begin with asking you to the Rib King, to talk to us about the Rib King and your use of race and representation, and how the novel focuses on the histories that get lost and left out of historical narratives. So I'd like to ask you to speak about how this project came to you, and I know that a large part of the influence of the project comes from a family history, so I'd like to ask you to talk about your family history in that response.
Thank you, Anna. It's wonderful to be here. So the Rib King is, just to give some background about the book, it's a historical novel, and it's set in the first part of the 20th century, and in a city that resembles Chicago because it is, even though it's not named in the book. And it's about a man named Mr. Sitwell, who at the beginning of the novel is he's a household servant for a wealthy white family, and he and the cook invent a meat sauce that is marketed with a caricature of his face on the label, and it becomes a national sensation, but he does not get any of the profits from it, and instead spends the rest of his life touring the country as the Rib King, because that's the name of the product. So that is basically the plot of what happens to him, but there is obviously there's a lot more going on in the book. And one of the things that the book is about minstrelsy and the Great Migration, and also the emergence of modern commodity culture in the United States. And but a lot of it does have to do with representations of history. And in this book, there's a point where he finds there are 3 orphan boys that work in the kitchen in the house as well, and they're reading from a penny novel. He has a past that no one in the house knows about, which is that he's the sole survivor of a community in Florida that was destroyed during the racial violence that followed the Reconstruction, and there was a lot of this. So it's not literally based on historic fact, but the kinds of things that happened to him happened a lot. And actually, I did research that as well. There's a book called the Star Creek Papers that is about an entire town that was obliterated, and it was actually over the theft of a mule, and it just escalated, and all of the black people were basically run out of the entire county over a mule. And so that figures in here. So there's a lot, I did base it on a lot of different incidents. So at a certain point, very early on in the book, he finds the three orphans reading from a penny novel, and he recognizes it as a very skewed telling of what happened in his town. But it's completely changed, but he can still recognize it, and that sort of becomes the catalyst to what eventually leads to him becoming the Rib King, because becoming the Rib King actually implies a lot for him. And as I was talking to you about the fact that it's a book and it's sort of a misrepresentation of his own memories, his own background, was inspired by a personal incident. And it does relate again to the recording of history and why I write fiction and why I find fiction writing so satisfying, which is that in 1833, so a very, very long time ago, someone wrote a novel that featured my slave ancestors, and it used their literal names and occupations, and they're very much in the book minstrel stereotypes. And when I first read it, it was completely unfamiliar, these people, these figures that are in the book, except they have the same names and the same jobs, but they bore no relation to sort of the human beings that had been passed, their stories had been passed along to me like through my own family. And I also said that the reason I knew about this book was because they were all slaves of the first president and the fifth president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And in 2005, they had an exhibit. Oh yeah, they had an exhibit, Slavery and the Making of the University. That is my grandmother's grandfather. And the reason I found out about the book was someone presented it to me like, oh, there's a novel written about your ancestors by the wife of a former professor here. And she told me the name of the book, and I found it. So it was presented to me as heritage, or as part of my heritage, which is an even more complicated thing for me because there is so little written record of any of my slave ancestors' lives. So this novel and the portrayal of them as characters in this novel is actually, I think, the most substantial record of their existence that I know of. And it's all caricatures. So in part, maybe it's that I understood his reaction because it represents an erasure of them as human beings, but it's the only thing that's left. It's the only record that's left. So that's part of what it becomes a trigger for Mr. Sitwell. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the novel that you found that was written in 1833 by the Southern writer Caroline Lee Heinz.
Yes.
So how did you see that novel published in 1833 within the context of the anti-literacy laws that were also being passed in the South, and that relationship to your family history?
Right. So Mr. Sitwell in the novel he can't read. He has to have someone read the book to him when he finds out that it exists. So when this book was published, and I think anybody that deals with African American history you kind of have to deal with erasure as a part of that history because there are so few records of African Americans' lives. And what I noted was that when this book was written, the penalty in North Carolina there were penalties for anyone teaching black people how to read, but for another slave, it was a public whipping of 39 lashes. So it was corporal punishment. So there are these incredibly steep penalties for literacy for black people, and as that's part of why the existence of this book is so sort of I don't know, it represents a trauma to me because on the one hand this is a record or a portrait that in someone's mind makes sense, right? It's a legible portrait of African American identity, but then black people are physically, like they're not allowed to read. It's like the threat of black literacy is so strong that you would get 39 lashes for learning to read, basically.
Yeah, the way that you described the black characters in the novel, could you talk a little bit more about how their over-representation is really necessary for the coherence of the novel, in the ways that you mentioned that there are a lot of contrasts in one character, how one character can embody so many contradictions,
right,
and what those contradictions do in the story.
Right. Well, Mr. Sitwell is he came, like a lot of people during the Great Migration, was fleeing trauma, and actually all of the black characters, it's a pretty common theme too. There was a lot of racial terrorism in the South, right, at that time, and so that fueled a lot of people trying to leave the South and go to the North, and so that's pretty much what happened to everyone that works in this house. It's not really something they talk about. No one talks about that, but it's sort of the subtext for it. And when I was creating the characters, all of the characters are, I'll put it this way, I was aware that if you looked at them from a distance, they all resemble minstrel stereotypes. And that's part of the theme. They're not stereotypes to me. They're people, and I tried really hard to make them distinct and real. But you could tell this story from the perspective of their employers, the Barclays, and they would just be sort of darting in and out, you know what I mean, in the background, and they would look like stereotypes. So specifically like Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Mr. Sitwell seems the epitome of a loyal servant, and that's what someone calls him at some point in the book. And that's why they want to use his face as an icon for this product, right? But he has a whole very complicated set of reasons for why he behaves the way he does and why he's so invested in the stability of the house. So to them, a lot of his behavior that sort of seems like it's totally based on loyalty to his employer is actually because he's concerned for what will happen to the other people working in the house if they lose their jobs. So it's a much more sort of human motivation. And the same thing, the cook, whose name is Mamie, I don't know if people are familiar with these stereotypes, but
maybe it would be helpful for you to explain minstrelsy and the stereotypes and what they mean for U.S. history.
Yeah, okay. So minstrelsy was an extremely popular form of entertainment, and it's actually very important to just the later development of sort of musical comedy, musical theater in the United States, and it was blackface performances. So it's people, both black and white, performing in blackface with the, you know what blackface is, yeah. So, so no, it's very popular both before the Civil War and after the Civil War. So one of the things I was interested in was the impact of these stereotypes being so pervasive are these blackface images of black people, caricatures of black people being so pervasive, and the impact that had on African Americans' efforts to assert their rights as citizens following emancipation. Yeah, so that's and a lot of that also has to do with the commodity, the interest in commodities, the fact that in some sense the story is being told through the sauce, right? The creation of the sauce and how it becomes like a national product. Because minstrelsy, of course, is like an early incarnation of sort of the commodification of black identity, right? And then there's also the fact that black people were legally commodities before the Civil War. And then there's sort of butting heads with these images that, again, were extremely pervasive. So an interesting thing to the book, because I mentioned Uncle Tom.
Right, I was just going to bring that up.
And it actually comes up in the book, because I sort of was thinking about Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of Mr. Sitwell's personality, or the sort of the personality he assumes when he's working. So most people couldn't read, right, when Uncle Tom's Cabin came out. And my understanding is that the reason the story and the images became so popular was because a big part of the early minstrel tradition was Tom shows, performances so they were blackface performances of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but a lot of the things were, they were for comedic effect. So that comes up in there also, so, yeah. But yeah, so that I hope that explains the minstrelsy.
Yeah, I want to quote here from the Washington Post when they reviewed your book. The Washington Post calls The Rib King a fascinating story about ambition, race, and revenge. It reminds readers that history belongs to those who control its narrative, and that fiction can be as powerful and in some cases more influential than fact. So how did the experience of writing this story, how did you see that as a way of exploring this history, your own family history, or this larger U.S. history as well?
Oh, yeah. So I really like writing fiction, in part because it allows me to sort of make my own connections to things that happen, and I don't have to directly engage or rebut sort of a formal narrative of history, which I felt like if I was writing in nonfiction, I'd have to explain why I'm drawing these connections. So for me, it's like a much more visceral and direct kind of engagement with history, or also contemporary issues as well. So yeah, that's why I like fiction. And I also told you that the part of the reason I wrote this book was because I was very upset. I started writing it a while ago, clearly. It's actually technically a prequel to my first book. So I started writing it while I was writing the first book, and it came out of a reaction to Trayvon Martin. So things that were contemporary. Yes, so it was the acquittal of the person that killed Trayvon Martin. I don't know, do I need to explain Trayvon Martin to you, like what I'm talking about? Yeah. So it was an African-American teenager that was, he was going to buy an iced tea, I think in Skittles from like a store, and someone saw him and thought he looked suspicious. And they called the police, and the police told them to just wait, and instead he started following him through the parking lot. They wound up getting in a fight, and he shot and killed the teenager, and then he was acquitted, and they said it was self-defense. So, and obviously that's actually where the Black Lives Matter hashtag emerged in the wake of that, and it was very upsetting for a lot of reasons, for a lot of people, that was possible, that you could basically stalk someone and then say, a teenager, a child, really. In my mind, I have teenagers, so I can call them children. So yeah, that you could do that, and then say it was a grown man could do that to a child, and say it was self-defense when he wound up shooting him. So people were very upset about that. And so the book is placed 100 years prior. And again, I said Mr. Sitwell is motivated in the beginning really out of concern for the other employees in the house. And in particular, it's the 3 orphans that he found reading the penny novel. He's trying to be a caregiver to them. And he's very worried about what would happen to them if they had to leave the house. So I was thinking about that is such a fundamental threat that in terms of the stakes involved in being a caregiver to black children, right? That 100 years, as much has changed, that people still have to live with that kind of fear in terms of the safety of children, the vulnerability of children to racial violence. So that's part of the subtext. So I was very interested in thinking about these stereotypes and the impact they continue to have consciously and subconsciously in the culture. So one of the things I was talking to you about was the hoodie, and how they kept talking about that Trayvon Martin was wearing a hoodie, and that was part of what made him look threatening, which made me think about sort of, again, blackface masks, like that you're responsible for the stereotypes that are sort of imposed on you, and the penalty can sometimes be your life for not understanding that and sort of like presenting yourself accordingly. That people would actually say things like that was very disturbing to me as well. So that's where all that came from.
Right, and in many ways you're showing how the representation, these minstrelsy blackface representations, actually were so powerful that it shaped how this man saw a young boy who was just walking home with a bag of Skittles, and it transformed.
Right, and apparently that is credible to a lot of people. He was acquitted for doing that. So apparently that is a credible, I don't know, it's, you know, he looked threatening, and so I stalked him. I didn't turn around and go the other way, I stalked him because he was threatening me. But apparently that makes sense or has some logic to people. So
Absolutely, the hyper representation of someone and how it actually can lead to the end of your life, right? Yeah. So with that, I'd like to ask you to read from page 11, which I think speaks really very directly to this topic. This is the
in the beginning of the book when he finds the 3 boys reading, and again, it starts to sort of drive him a little bit nuts. His transformation into the Ribking is not a very happy or healthy process. It's a very unhealthy process. But this is when he first sees them reading the book, and he's looking for them. The book starts. He's on his way home, and he sees one of them through the window of the house, and he's not supposed to be in the front of the house. He's supposed to stay in the kitchen. So he realizes that if he is seen by his employers, that he will lose his job. So he runs back. He's gone back in the house to tell the boy to go back in the kitchen. And they're all 3 in the front of the house. When he reached the conservatory, he heard a loud, "Ooh," followed by a series of childish giggles. He pushed the door open and found the 3 boys huddled together on the floor near the piano, with Frederick at the center. From the halting sound of Frederick's voice, Mr. Sitwell could tell he was reading. Now that Cherokee knew that Wash Talbot, his former deputy, had been arrested, he had to make a choice. Keep his vow to never again set foot in Seminole County, or let the last remaining member of his gang fall into the hands of an angry mob. "What are you boys doing?" They spun around in unison and blinked back at him with enormous brown eyes. They were handsome children with bright round faces, thick eyebrows, full lips, and skin the dark red color of cedarwood. Their features were so similar that anybody would have mistaken them for actual brothers. In truth, they were not blood relatives at all. Their strong bond formed in the interest of survival on the waterfront. "Nothing, sir," Max smiled, eyes all innocent. "Just sitting here reading." "In the front of the house?" "Oh, nobody saw us. We made sure them folks was long gone before we came in here, Frederick said. He lifted his arms and rocked back and forth in imitation of someone else's waltz. We waited until they finished dancing. Mr. Sitwell frowned. Somebody saw you. I did. I saw Bart playing in the hall when I was on my way out. Then come to find you haven't even finished cleaning the kitchen. Not true, sir. Kitchen's all done, Bart said. Well, except for the pots. But remember last time how Miss Mamie told us not to disturb Mr. Barclay's guests with a lot of banging while folks were eating dinner? Figured this time we'd just wait until the dinner was over, so as not to bother nobody. The boy looked very proud of himself. It's all right, sir. We don't mind working late. The last guest left over an hour ago, Mr. Sitwell said. Really? Dang. It didn't feel like we'd been in here but 5 minutes. The boys stared at one another as if there was something wondrous about their shared trance. You mean to say we've been sitting here reading all that time? Mr. Sitwell held out his hand. Give it to me. Frederick gave him the book. On the cover was a picture of a tall, thin white man with green eyes and a long red beard, clutching a pistol in each hand. What is this? The Life and Times of Cherokee Red, Wild Man of the Reconstruction, Frederick said. You ever read it? No. But you heard about him, right? Started out during the war, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Now his gang's all busted up. He and his lady love moved out west to put the past behind them, and he's been trying his hand at being a farmer. But just when it seems like his gunslinging days are over, he finds out Wash Talbot, last surviving member of his gang, was caught stealing hogs and got himself locked up back in Florida. What? He stole a hog. Who did? Wash Talbot. Mr. Sitwell squinted at the cover. He'd never heard of Cherokee Red, but he knew the name Wash Talbot from when he was a boy back in Florida, just like in the book. He handed it to Frederick. Where does it say that name? Show me. Wash Talbot. Frederick opened the book and started flipping pages. After a while, he set his finger down and read. Another infamous member of the gang was Wash Talbot, who never would renounce his lawless ways. For years after the gang disbanded, he was still hiding out in the swamps of Seminole County, a terror to the neighboring towns. That's enough, Mr. Sitwell said. Pernicious lies. Sir, I knew that man. Who? Cherokee Red? Wash Talbot. He was a simple farmer. The boys looked disappointed. Probably not the same man then, Max said. Was your Wash from Seminole too? Mr. Sitwell shook his head. I don't recall. He was lying, compelled by a childhood admonishment to say nothing about where he came from, even though he realized there was no cause for it any longer. It was the same reason he'd refused to give his real name when, lured by the promise of food, he'd voluntarily entered the doors of the asylum 20 years before. And then again, a few months after that, when he found himself standing on the Barclays' back porch, hands clasped behind his back and wedged between those two other boys. Where did you get this? One of Mr. Barclay's guests gave it to us after Tuesday's party. Mr. Sitwell frowned. It's the truth, sir, Frederick said. We didn't steal it, Mr. Sitwell. I'm going to have to ask Mr. Barclay about that. That's fine, but can we finish it first? We were just getting to the best part. What part is that? It's the beginning of the end. Mr. Sitwell sighed. Despite the lives they'd led and the work they did, they were still such children. Yet he knew if they did not learn certain lessons, they would not last long in the Barclays house, to say nothing of the world outside it. You boys are going to have to be more careful. You've got to remember who you are. You've got to remember where. You shouldn't be in the front of the house. You shouldn't be talking to Mr. Barclay's guests, much less, as you say, accepting gifts from them. I didn't lie, Frederick pouted. I tell you, he said we could have it. That's not the point. What if you misunderstood the man's meaning? Or what if the man simply changed his mind? Don't you realize that an accusation of theft can be just as bad as a theft itself? Sometimes it's even worse. No, sir. I suppose we didn't think about those things, Frederick nodded. I understand. Mr. Sitwell frowned. He could tell from the boy's expression that Frederick thought he understood, but also that, in truth, he did not. Let's get back there and finish that kitchen before Miss Mamie sees it. Yes, sir. They scrambled to their feet and sprinted down the hall. Mr. Sitwell stood for a moment with the book in his hands, trying to decide what to do with it. He looked at the cover. Mr. Sitwell was only 9 when he left Florida, and there were many things about those early days he no longer recalled. The name Wash Talbot, however, was not one of them. The man had been a neighbor friend of his mother's, and, as he told the boys, came from a family of subsistence farmers, much like his own family had been. It certainly seemed more than mere coincidence that, as was true of the outlaw in the book, the Wash he remembered had come to his end over conflicting claims with a man from the neighboring town over livestock. Except, and this too Mr. Sitwell remembered with perfect clarity, the Wash he'd known hadn't been jailed over a hog. It was a mule, and he hadn't stolen it. He'd shot it. So, there. That's the premise. Yeah.
So you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you. That was really, really. I would just always remark to Ladee how you would do such a brilliant work with dialogue, and it really brings the characters to life in such a deep way. So you said that the novel is loosely based in Chicago. It's loosely based in 1914 during the Great Migration, when black men and women were leaving southern plantations. But you really made it a point to unsettle any kind of fixed setting. And so during the reading, when I was reading your novel, I could really easily imagine the scenes happening in Brazil or in any city, really. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us about that decision to create a setting that was, to refuse actually a setting in a way.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, because it is, it was Chicago, one, because I told you I wrote my dissertation on the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, yeah, so I was very interested in that as like an event, in terms of just what it did. It meant a lot. It meant a lot into it. At the time I was interested in tourism, but it writing that forced me to think a lot about sort of the development and sort of retraining of people to want to buy things. There are all these like new things that they could buy, and how that sort of brought people together. And so anyway, I was very interested in that, and I was very interested in Chicago's role in that, and also as a destination during the Great Migration. And I also had to base it somewhere to write it, because it just needed that to write historical fiction, because just answering basic questions like whether or not people had electricity in their homes and things like that, it was very important to have it be very physically grounded for me in order to write it. But it's not about Chicago, and I didn't want it to be about Chicago. Like, I'm not telling a story about a specific place. It's almost like for me, because, and also in part because it is about the negotiation of trauma, and it's sort of a staging ground for people trying to live through and survive trauma, find a way to negotiate that, and to sort of reconceptualize their own identities. So it kind of transcended a specific place for me. And I think it's like it's sort of again a staging ground for like a process that a lot of people went through. Maybe in Salvador as well, yeah?
Absolutely. It's very parallel in many ways.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you discussed the characters that you created that were largely based off of minstrelsy characters like Mr. Sitwell, the Black Butler, Miss Mamie, the Mammy figure. So what do you think is the work of stereotypes? What kind of work do they do?
Oh yeah. So that's something I was interested in as well, and I think it does. It has ramifications again for the present. So there is sort of the loyal servant, Mr. Sitwell, that I referenced Uncle Tom when I was describing him. I love Mr. Sowell, by the way. I really do. I think he's he's my character, but I really care about him. I'm not, he kind of loses it very seriously, but I have a lot of empathy for him. And then Mamie is sort of based on, and she's very aware that she's performing a role. There's the Mammy figure, which actually appears in a lot of American films as well. Sort of like she's like a heavy-set black woman, and she's usually portrayed as very asexual. There are all kinds of little details to how that is constructed. The caricature or the character is constructed that I find fascinating. And then there's a maid in the house named Ginny. There is another very prevalent stereotype or caricature for minstrelsy. It's the Jezebel figure, and it's sort of like this hyper-sexualized character of a woman. So it's sort of the opposite of Mamie, and and so in here it's partially referenced by the fact that before she came to work in the house, she was an actress, which signifies a lot of things, or did back then, to a lot of people. And then the three little boys are kind of like, again, in Uncle Tom. There was a figure in early American theater they call it the pickaninny. So like Shirley Temple was a pickaninny, really, because it's sort of like bring out a cute kid, like when you're performing, because people love a cute kid that can dance, and they would call them like a pickaninny. But I also was thinking of like Topsy, just sort of these like, again, if you're glancing at them, they're not that to me. But I was aware that if you told this story from the Barclays perspective, right? So this book is from the perspective of two Southern women who are in the North, and they have two black servants, the black coachman and his wife, the maid, right, that are with them. And so all you see is the caricature. So I was very aware that if this book was being told from the Barclays perspective, they would probably appear very, very different than they do. And they're also very aware that they're performing roles. But in terms of what the stereotypes do, they do a lot of things, right? I guess we talked about Trayvon Martin and the hoodie, and I guess it's sort of, it's like erasure, but then like you're saying, it's like hyper visible, the mask. I was very interested in the women, and the threat of sort of sexual violence that is also related to economic exploitation, and how that is what those stereotypes do in terms of that. By saying, making like the household servant, the mammy figure, sort of asexual and non-threatening, sort of normalizes things that go on in the house. And then the opposite, but also normalizing, is the Jezebel as like an over-sexualized black woman. And I think about these things in terms of the vulnerability of black women, both during slavery and after, to sexual assault and rape. So one is that, she just, the Jezebel, she's just very sexual. She wanted sex. And the other one is, no, this is not an issue at all. So we have all these like household servants. And I was saying to you also too that one of my grandmother's brothers had told me that the reason that all the women have to get an education as opposed to the boys is because no one wants their sister having to work in someone's house, because it's dangerous, right? And if something happens, you don't have any recourse, right? So it's economic vulnerability as well. So in that sense, I am very interested. That's just an example of something that's kind of, in terms of the work that stereotypes can do.
Yeah, and they usually work in opposites. So one stereotype will contain two opposing things. So you have the Mamie and the Jezebel are actually working together. So asexual and hypersexual, but they work together to hide plantation violence, sexual violence, the rape, to, make it seem like it didn't exist or if it was wanted. So it's
Right.
they're working together, the
Yes.
two
Yeah.
characters. So with that, I'd like to ask you to read from page 59, which is
Okay.
the minstrelsy
Okay.
section.
So, all right, yeah. So this is everybody's performing, and again, I think that in part it's money. People perform their identities all the time, not just black people, for money. Yeah. So that's, I mean, people do in general, but in this house, it's like a lot of relationships are, I don't know, they become about money. So in the house where they're working, the person they work for, and this is why Mr. Sitwell has so much anxiety about everyone's job, is that they've fallen on hard times. And they're trying, their employer's trying to sell a manufacturing plant to this man who wants to, he wants to use it to, he says, to make a breakfast cereal, which is basically grape nuts. Because again, this is during a particular period of time, it's grape nuts.
Well, you remember grape nuts?
Yeah. So he comes to visit, and they're trying to impress him. They want him to do this. The stability of the household kind of depends on it. So everybody's invested in this, and there's a lot of bickering going on though in the kitchen. Again, because the money, they don't have enough money for all the things they need to run the house. So it's like a lot of problems. So this is when the man comes to visit that they want to buy the house. I was just going to read. It's like okay. So Mamie is in charge of the house, and she's just been arguing with one of the older maids about who's upset because she thinks everything's in disarray. So they go out, and there's someone at the door. Okay, so he washes his hands in the sink, then followed Mrs. Lawson out into the hall. They found Mamie standing near the front door with her back to them and her head down, muttering softly to herself as she prepared for the arrival of Mr. Barclay's guest. Mamie raised her right hand as a signal for them to keep quiet. She took a series of deep breaths, then raised and lowered her shoulders as she rolled her head from side to side. Through the window beside the door, Mr. Sitwell could see the car pulling to a stop in front of the house. "You ain't got time for all that now, woman," Mrs. Lawson said. Mr. Sitwell glared at her. What I mean to say is, I hope you didn't take offense at what I said before. All that kitchen talk, Mrs. Lawson said. That's all it was. I know you're doing the best you can. "You think you could do better?" Mamie said, still facing the door. "Because trust me, you wouldn't last a day." "Now, Mamie Price, I'm trying to apologize to you. I don't need your apology. Everything is going to get sorted out soon enough, and in the meantime, try not to get too confused. I know exactly what I'm doing." She took a final deep breath, then turned around. "Open the damn door, Mr. Sitwell." He pulled it back just in time to see Mr. Barclay bounding up the stairs. Beside him was a man in a dark blue suit who Mr. Sitwell had never seen before. "This is my cook, Mamie, the one I was telling you about," Mr. Barclay said as they stepped inside the house. Mamie bowed and did a small curtsy. "And she's clear on the restrictions for tonight's dinner?" the man asked. He handed Mr. Sitwell his hat. "Yes, of course. You haven't forgotten, have you, girl?" "No, sir," Mamie smiled. No meat byproducts." "That means no lard," the man said. "Yes'm, sir," Mamie batted her eyes. "No lard. No ham hocks." Mr. Sitwell stared straight ahead. This was the performance Mamie had been gearing up for, another element of the complexity of her role in the house. All the other servants were expected to make themselves as inconspicuous as possible, but the cook was often called upon to interact with the guests, to become part of the entertainment. Smiling and bowing in front of the house was just another part of her job. Mr. Barclay took a deep breath and said, "This man is Mr. Pound, Mamie. He is the progenitor of the cookless breakfast." "Cookless breakfast? Why, what on earth is that?" "Delicious wafers of wholemeal flour, molasses, and dried fruit, all baked and pressed under a patented process, introduced right here in the city at the World's Fair." "And do you eat them with ham and eggs?" Mamie blinked. Mr. Barclay laughed. "No, Mamie, you pour them into a saucer of milk and serve it cold. Now, when a man stands up from the breakfast table, instead of feeling sluggish and weighed down, he is energized, full of the fuel he needs to start the day. More fuel than ham and eggs? Mamie's eyes opened wide. Lottie, y'all white folks is a true wonder. What will you think of next? Mr. Sitwell looked at Mr. Pound. It was difficult to tell how much he appreciated Mr. Barclay and Mamie's performance. He nodded his head, looked around the hall, and smiled as if vaguely amused. Tell me, Barclay, is your entire staff colored? Yes, as a matter of fact, Mr. Barclay said. I prefer to maintain a staff of a uniform hue. Cuts down on conflict and, I've found, perhaps counterintuitively, the problem of theft. Is that right? Indeed. I realize there is a fad these days to go with the Irish, but quite frankly, from what I have seen, I still believe that as one is able to manage it, one is better off sticking with the colored race, in part because of the unfortunate prejudice, by which I mean that a perfectly respectable colored will happily work as a servant, while the white man content to do so will inevitably be of a lower caliber. This is unfortunate, Mr. Pound agreed, yet so often true. Well, of course, Mr. Barclay said. It's why, even if one is able to find a decent Irishman, he will so often prove surly, and I simply can't abide surly. Ultimately, it comes down to a certain simple question of genetic aptitude. One can't argue with generations of breeding. One can't argue with science. Isn't that right, Mamie? I'm still trying to wrap my man around this here cookless breakfast, Mamie said. She cocked her head and gave Mr. Barclay a puzzled look. But tell me, sir, why is it I've never heard of this marvelous invention before? Mr. Barclay sighed. Alas, Mamie, Mr. Pound's fine product is not yet available in stores here in the city. But that is why our friend is here. He is thinking of purchasing one of my manufacturing facilities. This will cut his transportation costs in half, so that soon his nutritious wafers can be made available not just in the city but throughout the entire country. Isn't that marvelous? Mr. Pound clucked his tongue. That's enough now, Barclay. I'm well aware of what this deal would mean over time. Your Mamie couldn't possibly understand such matters, and you and I shall have plenty of time to discuss them tonight over dinner. Yes, of course, Mr. Barclay said. And in the meantime, don't you worry none, Mr. Cookless Breakfast Man, about your restrictions. Much as it pains me not to throw a ham hock in there somewhere, I got something planned that I think is going to really satisfy you this evening. Yes, sir. Whip you up something real nice. Leave you feeling proper energized. Thank you, Mamie, Mr. Barclay said. She bowed and with a wide swing of her hips walked back to the kitchen. You'll forgive my enthusiasm, Mr. Barclay said. He and Mr. Pound began walking down the hall. It's just so rare that I have the opportunity to play a hand in the distribution of a product I so deeply believe in. It's quite all right. I must say I am curious to see how our diet finds interpretation in the hands of your Negro cook. I'm sure you will be pleasantly surprised, Mr. Barclay smiled. It will be a treat for me as well to see what is to be made of this diet of yours, as clearly it has served you well. You're looking quite fit, Pound, not a day older than the last time I saw you. It has been a while, hasn't it? When did we last see each other? I believe it was the night at the Monte Carlo. I believe you are correct. Well, perhaps this will prove another benefit of our transaction, the opportunity to see more of you in the city. Tell me, have you given much thought to who you intend to market your wafers to? Yes, Mr. Pound said, just before they disappeared into the parlor. All of them. Mr. Sitwell waited until the door closed behind him. He hung Mr. Pound's coat in the hall closet, then turned around, walked through the dining room, and pushed through a swinging door. When he got back to the kitchen, Mamie was already hard at work at the stove. Despite the theatrics at the front door, Mamie was well aware who Mr. Pound was, an old friend turned health reformer from Mr. Barclay's college days. He ran a longevity spa in the Berkshires and was currently making a great deal of money selling breakfast wafers and a series of books meant to promote the moral lifestyle that was to accompany their consumption. He was now interested in purchasing the plant with the ambition of making his wafers available on a national scale. Mr. Barclay had made a point of telling Mamie about Mr. Pound's peculiar dietary restrictions 2 weeks in advance, and ever since she had devoted a few hours each day to experimenting with different ingredients in order to come up with a meal that would be both sufficiently flavorful and would accommodate his particular needs. The elaborate seasoning she created was a combination of several ingredients, including dried onion, garlic, dill, horseradish, mustard, parsley, white pepper, turmeric, green and red bell pepper, rosehip, summer savory, mushrooms, safflower, coriander, fenugreek, basil, marjoram, oregano, thyme, tarragon, cumin, ginger, cayenne pepper, cloves, spinach, rosemary, cinnamon, paprika, yeast, celery, and orange and lemon peel. In combination, these had produced a seasoning that was not only remarkably economical, but also unlike anything Mr. Sitwell had ever tasted before. It was absolutely delicious.
So I'm going to just leave us with this photograph here, if you want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up to questions.
So the character in the novel I was talking about is November, his father, who moved, I think he came from New Jersey. The first president of the University of North Carolina was Caldwell also, and they came together, from what I'm told, to the university. But anyway, they've always been affiliated. They're very, affiliated with higher learning, in a sense. But it's sort of the shadow history of that. So literacy, all of these things, they are inspired in part by that, and my attitude towards historic narratives as well. I don't know. There's a lot to say, and I don't. So.
Well, thank you. Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? If there's anything, maybe we can continue through the questions.
Claire? Do we have a microphone?
Sorry, Emma. Thank you.
I've got quite a loud voice anyway. I'd just like to thank you for an incredibly rich discussion. I've been sitting here in total heaven. I'm just learning so much and thinking. And the question I'd like to ask you about is about commodities. I thought it was really interesting what you're talking about, the relationship between minstrelsy as a kind of commodification and the slave as a commodity. And I kept on thinking I had the question, then you answered it. But I'd like to ask you more about the hot sauce. Is the hot sauce like the grape nuts? Is it
a real product?
Well, what's it doing in the novel? Why is the hot sauce talking to that issue around commodification?
It was very interesting when this book came out, because they finally retired Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben and the Cream of Wheat Man, who nobody seemed to, his name is Rastus, but no one knew that. But they've been around, and they were not Uncle Ben, but I think Rastus, and certainly Aunt Jemima was also introduced at the Chicago World's Fair. So all of these kind of ubiquitous products, really, there's so many of them that were introduced at that fair, which is part of why it was so fascinating to me. I was really interested in the use of caricatures of African Americans to sell food products, specifically for maybe because of the durability of those icons. There's someone that wrote, and I'm sorry, I don't remember their name, but I really like this phrase, a slave in a box. And it was talking about sort of what was symbolized, like if you're, there's it's almost like the promise of consumer cultures, it's allowing people to have their own slaves, because you have these products that will do the work for you. And sort of putting these black faces on it, sort of, because again, also, it's very fraught, because again, slaves are commodities as well, but we're people. They've always been people as also, but it's just very fraught. But sort of thinking about the symbolism of that, like that, it's like this the distribution of what was formerly the privilege of the elite. Now everyone has, you can have instant pancakes, you don't have to slave all day, there's laundry detergent, there's all these things that are doing the work for you as if they were slaves. And that's part of the symbolism maybe that's running through those things. And so like in this too, I was also interested in artistry, because it seems to be weirdly signified, because people, I guess these are supposed to be quality products, so there's something that must be appealing or functional about them, as disturbing as maybe the caricatures that accompany them are. And so there's like a little sort of disjuncture for me, because they are kind of implying quality and reliability at the same time as they're being caricatured, which is why I put in that long list, to just imply in that there's a lot of work, right? To actually do her job required a certain amount of finesse and know-how and artistry that's not really acknowledged, weirdly, right? But it you know, to the extent that someone could look at like this and think, this is a quality product, I want to buy this is going to be good, and have these weird caricatures of black people on them, is sort of a bit of a contradiction of logic. Yeah. That's what I was interested in part.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for this very interesting and very important book at this moment in our lives and time. My question is about the emotional labor that you as a woman have had to produce in order to, but not just a woman of color, a black woman, a woman who's facing all sorts of racism in your own country. And if it's not day-to-day racism, you have all these sorts of microaggressions just because of your skin color. So there's that part of your life. And then you said that you wrote this book during the Travis Martin incident. And how do you deal with that anger that you feel? How do you turn that into some sort of an emotional, I mean, I think there's a lot of emotional labor in writing what you've written and in the stereotypes that you use, because you have to somehow reproduce them to function in a certain way as to contrast to a different group, because I don't think black people or people of color are not aware of these stereotypes. They're meant for another audience, aren't they?
That they're not aware of them?
I mean, if a person that faces racism is aware of their skin color and their race and their type and the stereotypes, how, let's say, the world sees them. So who is your audience, basically? This is, and what did you do with that emotional roller coaster? That
I think people of color are aware of stereotypes.
yeah, this is what I mean.
Yeah, because it's stressful, yeah.
But that's, I mean, sorry, maybe my question wasn't clear. What I mean is that people of color know these stereotypes because they live them, they hear them, they're instrumentalized against them. But when I read your book, when I see those stereotypes, I feel them too. And so I really wondered who was the audience. Was it for white people? Was it for a certain group to understand these stereotypes?
No. People have asked me that before. I don't like to explain why. You know what I say? It sounds maybe strange. I'm my audience for what I write. That's the most honest answer. And yeah, because I really don't like to, because it's a story. So there's not going to be very many, actually there are none, where I'm explaining what I'm trying to do, really. So I don't like to explain. It's like a distraction almost, trying to. So here's the interesting thing about race is that when I was in college, I turned in something one time, and the comment I got back was that they couldn't tell what race anyone was because I hadn't indicated it in the book. And I think if people don't know me or see it, maybe they would assume, I don't know if people still do this, that characters are white. I don't know. But that was the thing, like, that you're supposed to announce different, like, brown people. And then when you're writing, it's like, when does this become part of, when is it necessary for this character to stop and say, look at how brown I am? Do you know what I mean? Like, look, I'm brown. And so it's very strange as a writer, and I don't do that. I don't like to do that. So maybe it comes, I hope sometimes if it's necessary, it comes across in other ways, but I don't, so that's why I say me, because I don't want to step outside of the characters and try to explain them in a way that doesn't fit in with the actual story or the experience of them that I'm trying to. It's a very strange thing, actually, to think about an external audience. I do imagine.
No, I'm not a writer.
Yeah, no, but it's weird. That was always very strange to me because one thing is I used to write a lot of stream of consciousness, and so if people said, well, I can't tell, or like the way that people talk was sometimes like, because people do code switch. So for me, this character would talk like this to these people and then talk like that to his brother. And that's part of who they are, but it doesn't really fit in to try and, explain it, you know? There kind of is an explanation of what Mamie is doing in here. But in general, I don't like to step outside of the story and think about the audience. You know what? Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that's just like a particular burden for writers of color or women or something like that. Like yeah, it is painful, but that I do like to inhabit it in the same way. And also I found, someone else asked me that question, there are a lot of angry writers that are angry about all kinds of things. And one of the things that writing about it also makes it fascinating, the things people do. It makes it, it's sort of like, it does put me at a slight remove from it. And a lot of these things that are really horrible and complex, they're also fascinating that people behave this way or process things in that way or depend on these ideas for like the basis of their own self-esteem and identity and stuff like that. And I think that writing about them and sort of exploring them, it does become it's a very satisfying way to sort of deal with anger, is to work through it as art. Yeah?
Yeah, and also it's interesting to think about when you're writing about race, because you're also working with a social structure, a power structure, but if you're doing it through the realm of representation, then you also have to confront things like, how do you write in a way a character that's actually never really seen,
Right.
Right, as a person, and they're seeing through representation, and you're working within that realm also.
Right.
So there's many layers of challenges in
That's
doing
right.
that work.
That's right. And that was very true in with this book especially, because that was part of the point. And that's when I say I know what they look like to the people they work for. But as Mamie at one point remarked, Mr. Barclay knows better, right? And so some of the things he does are more unforgivable than someone who just saw her, like Mr. Pound, who just saw her. But she's like, really, Mr. Barclay knows better. So yeah, it's interesting. But that's part of the point, is like writing about people that, we're not allowed to really leave their own record of who they were. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ladee, for being here with us, and thank you.
Thank you.